Okay. Good afternoon. Good morning again. Welcome to this final session of the 2 days. This final session is looking primarily at diversity and inclusion, and I'd like to welcome my panel, which hopefully they will appear. There they are. Brilliant. As if by magic. So, listen. So, good morning, everybody. And welcome. So, for those of you who've been exercising keen interest over the last couple of hours, you'll realise it's me again, so I won't go through my introductions. But this final session of the 2 days, it is the final session, but actually it might be the most important discussion we're about to have over the 2 days. I'm joined by a super group of people today to talk about diversity and inclusion, namely Julia Hoggett, CEO, London Stock Exchange, Daniel Dansko, who's Global Diversity Manager at Linklaters, and Marshall Bailey, OBE, Chairman of MUFG Securities and Chairman of the Financial Services Compensation Scheme. Not going to say too much more about the panel. You'll learn more about them as we go through. But I think hopefully you see that this group is ideally qualified to talk more broadly about diversity and inclusion. Often, when you get given the task of moderating a panel, we all reach for the Google button to figure out, what's the topic going to look like. And I have to say I did exactly the same. So when you do a Google search on diversity, it comes back with, is any dimension that can be used to differentiate groups and people from one another. It goes on to say, in a nutshell, it's about empowering people by respecting and appreciating what makes them different in terms of age, gender, ethnicity, religion, disability, sexual orientation, education, and national origin. All pretty clear. And then inclusion is an organisational effort and practices in which different groups or individuals having different backgrounds are culturally and socially accepted and welcomed. Okay, so that's the science that Google tell us we're dealing with. So what have we done so far as an industry? So recently, and partly as a driver for this discussion, I was delighted to be part of the Bank of England-led Meeting Diverse People initiative, which, as the name suggests, is an initiative led by the bank and primarily by the new governor, Andrew Bailey, to actually think about broadening out the communications. Very important message from him was that he wants the bank to be representative of the people it represents. That's an interesting statement that perhaps you wouldn't have expected to see from a Bank of England governor maybe even 5 or 10 years ago. So I'm sure we'll get to talk a little bit more about what that means and the role of regulators in a few moments. And then closer to home, some great work done by the London chapter of the Women in Securities Finance Association or group, where once again, it's all about making those connections and broadening out those relationships. And I think we've all had to think about that a bit more in a COVID pandemic working from home sense, because the opportunity to meet face to face has been different recently. So that's sort of what I think the Google science is telling us. That's some of the things that we're doing, but without further ado, Julia, I might turn to you first. And I'm sure over the years you've seen much discussion on this broad topic. And I'm sure some of it has encouraged you, and some of it has probably been a bit less encouraging. But how would you describe where we are as a society, and what are you seeing in the financial services industry today around diversity and inclusion? And frankly, I'll ask you the question, are we doing enough? So, Julia, welcome.
Thank you. Are we doing enough? I'm not certain we ever feel we're doing enough of anything. So I think that's probably my generic answer. I mean, look, I've been in financial services for almost 25 years now, and I have seen an enormous change in that time. The fact that an openly gay, diminutive lesbian is the CEO of the London Stock Exchange and nobody really batted an eyelid, I think, is an illustration of how far things have come. And certainly as both someone who's been actively involved in diversity and inclusion and somebody who's regulated firms seeking to address diversity and inclusion over the last few years as a regulator at the FCA, I've seen the journey that a lot of companies have been on. I haven't met many CEOs of major global investment banks who actually can't speak entirely passionately about diversity and inclusion. Where I've got to is I think we need to change the nature of the conversation we have from very akin to climate change, and you've just had a sustainability panel, but climate change and addressing the race to net zero is no longer about discussing whether climate change is an issue. It's about figuring out the practical, tangible steps we're going to take to address it. And I feel exactly the same way about diversity and inclusion. I think a different point, though, is the key to unlocking, really making progress in diversity and inclusion, I think, is inner framing. In the same way that addressing climate change is about people really framing it as an existential risk that needs to be addressed in the here and now, as a near and present, then I think the value of unlocking true diverse and inclusive organisations is the way we need to frame the conversation about what we do next. I think of diversity and inclusion as about creating environments where everybody has an equal opportunity to thrive. And the simple reality is that isn't how we've been structured as a society. And if you look at the gender pay gap, if you look at the representation in the city, it still isn't how we're there. And one of the challenges is that the intent, I think, has changed radically over the last 20 years that 25 years I've been in the city. But people are also still scrabbling around for what to do about it. And I think the how is the challenge, and we need to be much more practical about that. And let me give you one simple point. I was sent a stat this morning that says that one study estimates that the loss in human capital wealth due to gender inequality is $160.2 trillion. So the idea that any organisation actually wants to employ, say, 100 staff, but only generate an opportunity for 48 of them to thrive is ludicrous. And actually, if we think about other diverse characteristics, one might actually say that's probably only about 35 of them to thrive. So how people think about their senses of meritocracy, etc., to really change that dial is, I think, the shift. And to me, that is the conversation we need to have. How do we think about what organisations are acting in service of in order to change the meritocracy to actually act in service of that thing? Now, I agree with Andrew Bailey. He said the same thing at the FCA. How can you regulate on behalf of everybody if you don't represent the people and have the experience of the lives in whose behalf you're regulating? So really having a proper corporate purpose conversation and then saying, is our meritocracy really serving that corporate purpose, is the thing that I think we need to shift. And I'll leave you with one final provocative point. Or two. The first is that meritocracies are often mechanisms for maintaining the status quo whilst making ourselves feel better about it, because most meritocracies reward the traits and characteristics of those who are already at the top, and then we wonder why it produces the same outcomes. So I actually think our HR processes and what we value needs to shift. And the final point, and this is I deliberately frame it provocatively, but I think it's true, which is that very often we require a level of empiricism to change the status quo that we don't require of the status quo. There is no empirical evidence that men dominating the upper echelons of the corporate world in this country produces the best outcomes. It's not a feminist comment, it's not a diversity and inclusion comment, it's a research methods comment. By definition, we've never had a control group to prove it. And yet we seem to demand a level of proof of improvement to change the status quo that we don't require of the status quo. And I think if we just change those two pieces of framing in the way we think about it, we might have a much more tangible route to making tangible differences in the level of inclusion that happens, not just across the city, but across the world.
So just before I move over to Daniel, I just wanted to follow up on one thing you said there. You talked about the meritocracy of the status quo prevailing and therefore the outcomes are almost inevitable. How would you describe how well financial services is on that spectrum? Are we particularly bad at that as a group? Because we might look at large banks and go, yeah, they're a logical suspect for that. Is that fair or not?
It was really interesting. When I was a regulator, one of the things I used to say, and I was guided by something that happened to me in my onboarding interview when I was first hired into the city in JP Morgan in the 1990s. And there were two statements that were put next to one another that I still recall to this day. The first was, we're an investment bank and our human capital goes up and down the lift every day. And the second was, we're really good investment bankers and lousy managers, and it's your job to manage your career. It took me until 10 years into my own career to realize how ludicrous it was that those two statements were next to one another, and that they actually were nonsensical. If you think your true value is your human capital, why do you not foster as a skill the capability to manage and get the best out of it? And yet actually very often that's not been the case. So one of the things as a regulator we used to say is, why do you assume that your most effective producer has to run your desk? Your most effective producer may not be the best people manager, they may not be the best controls-minded person, they may not even be growth-minded, they may be brilliant at selling their product and maximising their P&L. They can still be on your desk, maximising their P&L and doing brilliantly, but are they actually the best people to run your desk? And we started to see changes in who was hired into certain roles, and the role modelling of that about what an organisation valued and what it saw as talent actually shifted as a consequence. And that felt like a huge risk to do at the time. And it happens more and more now. But it needed that kind of framing conversation before that shift would happen.
Okay. I would agree from my personal experience. I do recognise the idea that to actually give people a bigger reward, the only way you can do is promote them, and then traders suddenly become managers, and that isn't always the best outcome. I'm sure we'll come back to that, particularly when I bump into some of my trader friends later. Okay, so Daniel, can I maybe go to you next? For anyone looking at your most recent CV, I think we would regard the fact that perhaps you've moved from the activist world into the corporate world. What does that tell us about where we are on the diversity and inclusion sort of journey in terms of, is it now, does that make sense? So interesting to understand a little bit about why you did that, why you made that change, and what's happening within your corporate world today.
I mean, I think it does make sense, but you know, it's an atypical journey, if you will. I mean, I kind of have my background in the academic world. I studied this, so I was able to, you know, translate the academics and the theory into something that actually produced tangible solutions for some of the problems that businesses were going through today. When I was working at Stonewall, we were very much kind of fighting a legislative battle as well as a social battle. One of the things that I gathered from working with the hundreds of businesses who we were engaging with to try and help, realize what their strategy could look like and how to engage their people was that the commonality of the challenges that D&I present are the same, but how they manifest in different industries and different companies, and therefore the solutions that they come up with they have to be quite unique. And so coming into a corporate environment where it wasn't just about the theory and the passion behind the knowledge, it was being able to take that and apply it to, common business decisions that don't immediately look like they have something to do with D&I. And the reason why this is such an important thing for businesses today is because diversity and inclusion as we know it, as this entire industry, it's evolved. And it's why it's on the minds of boards and CEOs, because the big social forces that we're dealing with, things like, COVID and racism and homophobia and socioeconomic exclusion, gender imbalance, those social things that have effects on people. Businesses are now trying, they're understanding what D&I professionals have been saying for years, that it's those things, how a business interprets the impacts of those on their processes and institutes equity where there wasn't any before. And I think that has become more of a progression for businesses. I think diversity and inclusion right now is a critical lens that people are applying to different situations and different decisions. And the fact that people today have responsibilities in D&I that previously they didn't. I mean, even procurement teams have regulations now on how they invite access for small, medium enterprises to compete. And that's about diversity. So it's far outside of good and bad people and behavior. And I think this is where businesses right now are challenged with going back and looking at the entirety of their system and trying to both institute mechanical measures and checks, like how do we collect our data and what does that data tell us, along with the culture that they need to bring along with it, so that should we focus on any particular aspect, what happens to those individuals when they're brought in? Are they only going to be seen as a target, or will they actually be seen as the talent that they represent? And I think these are the big challenges that are happening in business. The one thing I will say I've noticed as being the global diversity leader for Linklaters is this is not just something that is happening in one jurisdiction. The connectivity in the internet has meant that some of the conversations around things like race or LGBT, which could be really localized, have become global conversations. And now, if you think about it, the skills that leaders had to manage the workforce of yesterday, they are not the same skills that they need today. And I think that it is a reckoning almost. That the challenge with that is not rushing to whatever you think the quick fix is going to be, and actually looking at how you manage your workforce. It's all in ESG, sustainable workforces. What do you need to do to take these social forces and make them something that has equity, so that people in your business will stay, thrive, and your brand is enhanced?
You mentioned a quick follow-up question before we maybe just open up some of the debate with Marshall. But you mentioned that some of these forces are truly global forces, and things like social media are able to spin a message or something around the world in moments when it's working. But there you go. But the question is, the reaction to that is that different in different regions? So would you say that the idea of embracing some of the things that you're working on, is that common across the globe, or do you see, for example, Europe in one particular place and the US in another, or is it pretty similar? What would you say?
I think that the impetus, so you take something like the murder of George Floyd and Black Lives Matter. Now, obviously, that was detailing the experiences of one group, African Americans, but the connectivity in cyberspace, with all of us sitting down, having been locked down because of COVID, we had a lot more time to really digest the information. And what that did was it created conversations about race and racism, one for Black populations across the world. So Black British people were saying, we're not getting killed by police, but I get stopped and searched, disproportionately. And people from Belgium were saying, I may not get killed or stopped and searched, but I can't get an apartment. So it showed a commonality of racism. But what it did was it opened up lines to talk about those things where this wasn't a population. So in our office in Singapore, for example, they were able to take that, and our colleagues from India were able to say, actually, I'm maligned by mainland Chinese. In Germany, we were able to talk about history versus the common conversation. So I think that's what I mean by even though some things are happening in discrete jurisdictions, in other parts of the world now, because of this connectivity, we are having a global conversation. And that is happening far outside of just race, but it's happening with COVID. It's happening with returning to work. It's happening with, who our investors are and what they demand on us and what clients want. So it's gone far outside of HR and good and bad people. And this is why business leaders are kind of frantically looking at how can we revamp our entire process, but we've got to bring culture along with it.
I want to come back to sort of the change of culture in organisations in a moment. But Marshall, I just wanted to maybe bring you in. Some of the work that you've been working on and groups you've been working with, does what you've just been listening to resonate with what you're seeing and the groups that you're interacting with?
Oh, it absolutely does. I I don't consider myself at all a specialist in this topic. I consider myself an individual with a certain amount of convening power and a certain amount of leadership drive, and I come at it from an interest in good decisions being made. Right. When I think about the 30-year journey for me, and specifically in the context of banking, I can recall 30 years ago having 5 Canadian banks competing in Canada, where I'm from. All of them looked the same, sounded the same, and were approximately dealing with the same issues. When you fast forward to today, there is a clear leader and there are clear laggards. And the difference that I've observed in that time is around decision making. How did those people leading those institutions come to better decisions? And I think it's about having the right people around the table. And to the points made by both of my colleagues here on the panel, you need really to be challenging yourself. You need to get away from these traits of dominance and self-imposed ideas of meritocracy and so forth, and really be in a position to listen to others. And particularly when you can encourage a different perspective to the one that is shared by the majority, when you can encourage a voice that you often don't hear enough of to speak and give it its place at the table, then you can do a lot. So I've asked myself, as I've risen up the ranks, if you will, I now chair and have chaired a number of entities. Who can I have at this table who can help this entity arrive at the best decisions? And that diversity takes all kinds of forms. But what it takes from me as a leader of that discussion is to ensure that we are hearing the right voices from the right kinds of places. So we actively want to hear from employees. We actively want to hear about challenges we face. We, of course, focus on profits and success and all of those classic measures, but it's enhancing those discussions in a way that has really yielded tangible results. And I think it's sort of in evidence everywhere. I guess the one area that I would caution us on is that I think here in the developed West, if I can use that outdated phrase, we really have made tremendous progress. I entirely agree with Julia there, and I'm so happy to hear her say that she's felt that in her lifetime. I feel so many of us have. But we are far from having won the battle here yet. There's all kinds of places, and even here in the UK, in outside of financial services, let's say, or the professional services, where we have more work to do still, let alone in the broader reaches. So it will take us time, but we can lead and we can show examples and we can put constructs in place that enable this. So we should. So I'm really very encouraged by what we've been able to do and what I've seen others able to do, and I look to them for that passion and leadership.
Just to follow up from me, because I want to go back to Julia in a moment on something else, but as you've wanted to get those different voices around those board tables, as you put it, has that been a challenge at times? Have you received pushback? I mean, presumably that hopefully that pushback has got less and less in more recent times.
So the pushback, I think, is lessened. The argument that people often have raised is that there simply isn't a deep enough bench. We don't have enough candidates, so we've gone out to recruit people, and we simply can't find individuals to give us a diverse slate. And I've always disagreed with that. Firstly, because in my experience, we've been able to find that diverse slate. But there are, traditional areas where there are fewer women, let's say, than there are men. And my view is, well, let's build that bench then, and let's really, as rapidly as we can, accelerate the skills of the individuals involved. And that comes through mentorship and sponsorship programs. That comes from giving people a sense of confidence in themselves, even, and giving them a chance to participate. So yes, you do have to find the best people for the job, but it's never been an impossibility. I'll give you an example. On the board of the FSCS, we are now, if I include the executive leadership team as well, we're now 75% women. We're more than 30% openly LGBT. We have a mixture of ethnic backgrounds. And there's a number of other ways that we could count: cognitive diversity, backgrounds, experiences, socioeconomic. And they're all there really participating at a very high level. And we see that in employee engagement scores. We see that in our productivity measures to the extent that those have value. And we certainly see that in our common purpose and our shared purpose and the drive that brings people to work every day. And it's having the opportunity to bring these people to our table and have them have a voice that is visible to the outside world. It's been tremendously helpful. There are other places where it's been more difficult. You want to have from a group of bond traders, let's say, it may be more difficult, but that's where building the bench strength can be so important. And I think all companies can work on that.
Okay. Thanks for that. So, Julia, just going back to you. Obviously, you mentioned your time at the FCA. what's your thoughts on the role of the regulatory community around this issue? Because clearly we've seen some very, very bold and forward-thinking from Andrew Bailey and his colleagues, which I think we would all support. But do you think they should go further in terms of actual regulation or guidance? I always worry about that because an individual might find themselves sitting there thinking, well, am I actually the best person or am I a quota? Any thoughts on that?
All very good questions. I mean, I was at the FCA on its Executive Diversity Committee as it went through the journey of really working on its own diversity and inclusion approach for its own staff, and then starting to evolve how it would articulate more externally its role as a regulator. Now, all public bodies in the UK have a public sector equality duty, which isn't just to act in a manner that doesn't discriminate, but it's actually to publicly promote and actively promote active and appropriate engagement between diverse communities. So just saying you care about diversity and inclusion arguably doesn't take you far enough. So the FCA has produced two pieces of work very recently, one discussing the overall role of regulation in diversity and inclusion, and the other very much looking at listed companies and diversity within listed companies. And I think there is the challenge that if it is articulated incorrectly, I haven't found a better way, and it's a really blunt way of describing it, but the problem of I'll have one of them, one of them, one of them, and one of them. Now, diversity and inclusion isn't about that. If you are genuinely caring about creating a diverse and inclusive organisation, you want an organisation where everybody can thrive, and therefore everybody should be in the seat because they've had the opportunity to bring and show their best in the organisation. And if an organisation is creating a culture of, well, you're only there because, then it's not serving anybody at all. And I think that sits with the culture of the organisation to address and make sure it does not create that narrative. And certainly when I've seen mentorship programs be developed in the past, I've sometimes seen that actually the populations to whom they've been focused have been the ones most resistant to those changes, for fear of people saying you're only there because. My response to that is that, and forgive me, straight white men have had sponsorship and mentorship programs for time immemorial in the workplace. It's just we don't call them sponsorship and mentorship programs. We call them conversations with the management. The reality is that there's always been mechanisms of sponsoring people. It's just most organisations have traditionally focused those mechanisms on quite a select few. And then they haven't thought of themselves as being given special measures to enable them to succeed. And we need to unpack that and open that out. I think it's important that all parts of society have a role in thinking about that conversation. And so I understand entirely why the FCA has raised the issues it has, and why it's focused on increasing inclusion within listed companies as well. And an awful lot of the data, despite my absolute argument against having to use empirical evidence, is that more diverse institutions produce better results on a more sustainable basis. Sorry, go ahead.
So that was going to be my next question. So there is clear evidence. You mentioned you don't necessarily like to use that much, but those organisations that effectively embrace diversity and inclusion are beginning to see tangible outcomes in terms of performance.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah, absolutely. I got sent some more data this morning that for looking at the listed funds on the LSE, those with all female and mixed management teams have consistently outperformed those with all male management teams. And if you look at fund performance over the last 3 years, those with mixed management teams have experienced 58.1% performance compared to all female, which was 55.5%, and all male, which was 38.6%. So yeah, but it's actually everywhere you look, it is important. I think it's also about the framing piece, and it goes back to that really simple adage. If you create an organisation that employs 100 people that roughly represents the diversity of society, but you only create structures where 50% or 30% of them are actually enabled to be their best and perform at their best, you're not generating the best outcomes for yourself as an organisation. And you're most likely to have a level of groupthink and a level of assessment of the world that is framed through the experience of a very small percentage of the population. And therefore really thinking about, in my mind, what your corporate purpose is, what you're actually there to do as an organisation, and have you got the right people around the table to deliver it, is the critical issue. And very often, corporate purposes have not been defined as the end outcome that the institution is seeking to produce. It's been kind of defined by the metric it's measuring as to its profitability. And I think when organisations go to that end outcome articulation, they tend to realise that there is absolute rationale for having much greater diversity to deliver those very outcomes that they want to achieve.
Okay, so that's fascinating. And Daniel, I might just segue to you at that moment, in that I think the points that June are making are very, very clear around how proper embracing of the diversity and inclusion approach is creating tangible outcomes. Are you seeing that as well with the work you're doing and your clients?
Absolutely, and I just wanted to add on to that. I mean, I think that the consultation paper that came out from the FCA and the things that they're proposing, they're not new in other industries. I mean, we're under regulations to report on a whole lot of things in the legal industry, and certainly there have been other businesses that have been doing those exact things for ages without needing to have a governing body say you should do it. The reality is, in today's world, you should know what your board's composition is and have a pipeline and have an inroad to your people to find out how they're feeling about the decisions that you're making about them. I do think that there is an over-reliance almost at, kind of bussing in diversity where it's going into environments that have not had the own preparation for what it's like for somebody different to come into a board situation. They're just trying to bring difference in without working on the inclusion of it. And I think those two things have to go hand in hand. I think the other thing that I am seeing is that there is a real almost dissonance to someone or a regulatory body saying that you must do these things. But when you think about it, left to our own devices, we have what we've got today, an overpopulation of a certain type of person or groups of people that make it into senior positions and end up having most of the power, whether it's access to or creating culture. And so for me, looking at how long it's going to take to change certain things, it becomes super important that those individuals who are in those positions absolutely understand their own diversity and how that is situated in this debate, their own biases and how those things can act out, and not just to say we've had training and therefore we're over it. I mean, it's a constant daily thing. We have known for ages that greater diversity yields financial results as well as brand results, but it's because business was unprepared and unwilling to actually chart those metrics in ways that made sense. Now that we start to have like McKinsey and other groups that are, finally saying that there's a positive correlation, businesses again are starting to scramble to try and figure out what can we measure, how can we move it. So we are seeing a lot of those debates coming in. I guess the challenge for me is, alongside the mechanics of moving your business, what do we measure? What do we use it for? What does that mean for us? It's also this notion that, and this is the one thing that in the consultation I didn't see as much of a focus on. It was mentioned, but it is the cultural work that you've got to do alongside it to ensure that when you bring a diverse perspective up into your board where it hasn't been before, that those people aren't like, well, you are of course the diversity candidate or the social mobility candidate or the woman. That they've got to recognize that talent should have always been there. So for me, I think that the biggest thing that's going to come is an engagement from the majority to kind of understand that it's them that need to be mentored in order to allow diversity to flourish. It's not the diverse groups.
That I didn't ask you to sum up because we're at the end of time, but you sort of did. That's fantastic. So I might just quickly go to Marshall just to give you your final thoughts before we hand off to Julia to close for us. But Daniel, great summary of where you sit. Marshall, how would you leave it for the group?
Look, it's been great for me to hear from people, but as the straight white male on the panel who is succeeding in bringing these people in, it's for me the benefit is enormous. It's, as Daniel has just said, every day I feel like we are getting better at this, and it's because of the inputs from all corners. It doesn't matter how you measure them, but it's being able to listen to them and then allow them to thrive and do everything you can to move them up. As Julia quite rightly said, there was a time when senior people in my organizations would have taken me aside and helped to develop me, and I feel that that's my onward duty now to do that for other people. And I do that, and we all do that. I hope we do it for our children, we do it for our friends and our family, and we do it for the people we see a lot of potential in. And the broader we can get that into society, and the broader perspectives we can bring in, then the better off we will be. And the sooner the better, as far as I'm concerned.
Marshall, many thanks there. Julia, finally, just going back to you, what will be your closing thoughts for the group? We talked a little bit about, the journey we've been on, where we are today. What will be your key message that you'd want to leave with the group?
Well, I think I'd amplify what Daniel said, that you can't have diversity without inclusion and inclusion without diversity. And the genuine sense of, okay, how do we make sure we recognise the true talents that we can have to enable everybody to thrive, but we have that environment where that's how they feel. And there is a certain amount, I think, of a responsibility of leaders to curate that world, to reinforce that world, and to curate the conversations. And some of that, as Daniel said, happened around the time of George Floyd. But we also need to be aware, and I think Marshall's made this point as well, that this is not a linear journey, and different places around the world are in very different places on this and still have a long way to go. And we can never assume we've got there and we've banked it. And one of the biggest risks we have in this conversation about culture is this sense of things being binary and oppositional. If we include these people, then I'm going to lose out. And I think one of the true responsibilities of leaders is to not construct this conversation as binary, to recognise that actually this is about enabling the world to benefit from the true talents of everybody in this world. And the way if we do that, we maximise the upside for everybody, and we create a much healthier and vibrant and more dynamic economy, better organisations, and a healthier world for us all. And that is really the outcome. It sounds very soppy, actually, but we have willingly underutilised the talents of a huge percentage of our populations for many, many years. And actually, that's the thing we have to crack and not position it as a binary or oppositional thing. And I think as leaders, we have a true responsibility to make sure we frame the conversation that way.
Okay, Julia, many thanks. And also, I'm afraid we're out of time. I personally found this a fascinating discussion. So I'd like to thank Julia, Danielle and Marshall for their input. And I think that concludes the final session of the 2 days. So once again, many thanks to my group.